Today we're going to talk about the Gilded Age in the East and the West. You might think, where does this phrase come from, the Gilded Age? Well, it's actually a phrase that's taken from a book by Mark Twain. Mark Twain being the American novelist who oftentimes wrote books poking fun at American society and also highlighting a lot of what he felt were very troubling aspects of American society. And he writes this book in 1873. And he writes it to highlight what he felt were a lot of the problems going on in American society, particularly the rampant corruption among officials in the government, rampant corruption among powerful business owners and titans of industry, and also this sense that he was concerned about a sort of flex morality that people felt it was okay to break the law if they made money in the end, or they felt that it was okay as long as they didn't hurt too many people. And he disliked this, felt it was really destroying American society. So he writes this book to highlight, in a sense, the problems in American society. American historians have taken this term, they've used it to describe the period that Twain's writing about, ultimately the 1870s through the 1890s. And so when we talk about the Gilded Age, ultimately we're referring to this particular time period in American history. It's a time period that's characterized with four primary trends. One we've already talked about, which is industrialization, this growth of American industry during the second industrial revolution. The other three trends we're going to focus on today, first of those is immigration. I'm talking about immigrants coming to the United States in great numbers. We're also going to talk about urbanization, which is the growth of cities in the United States. And finally, we're going to focus on the development of the American West, because this is another important trend that's taking place at the same time as these other trends are affecting primarily the East Coast. But the American West is also being affected by the same forces that are affecting the East, including industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. To focus on our first topic, this issue of immigration, because ultimately this is a time period that's shaped by immigration. The United States has always been a nation of immigrants, but this is a time period where we see greater numbers of immigrants arriving in the United States than ever before. There have been three waves of immigration in the United States, as this graphic shows. This first wave, which really ends by the Civil War period, was largely English and German speakers, people primarily from Western Europe, from England, Ireland, western parts of Germany. And the numbers had been relatively high before the Civil War ends in 1865. And they continue, of course, as this graph shows, but at the same time, they are far lower than the next major wave of immigrants, which arrive beginning roughly the decade or so following the Civil War, which were immigrants from Eastern Europe. And as the graph shows, we see the huge growth of immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe during this time period. A last group that it's important to highlight during this era is that there are immigrants from Asia, primarily China and Japan, during this era, until it ultimately is largely ended around the turn of the century. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So as these graphs illustrate, we can see that there's a lot of immigration in the United States during these decades after the Civil War. And much of that immigration is indeed coming from Central and Eastern Europe. One of the reasons for that is that we have certain, as historians would call them, push and pull factors that play a role in bringing immigrants into the United States. And so one of those, first we'll talk about these push factors. One of these has to do with agriculture and land in Europe. And one of the factors that's influential here is that during the second half of the 19th century, European agriculture becomes more efficient. And as a result, fewer people are needed to grow crops on the land. In some areas like Eastern Europe and Russia, serfs who were essentially slaves to land are freed by the Russians in the 1860s. And so many of them want to leave Russia and go elsewhere. So we have these important agricultural land factors that play a role here. We also have problems. There's crop failures in parts of Europe during this time period. We also have issues of starvation, of course, drive people off their land as well. And what we also begin to see in Europe during the 19th century is a population boom. In fact, the population of Europe essentially doubles during the course of the 19th century, despite all these other problems. And so as a result, there's less land, less food, less resources to go around. So many people decide to go to the United States or other nations in the Western Hemisphere to simply escape from these bad conditions in Europe. Now, of course, there are also pull factors that pull people out of Europe as well as Asia and bring them to the United States. One of these is that as businesses grow during the second half of the 19th century, we see a labor shortage. There simply aren't enough American workers to work in a lot of these expanding businesses, these big industries. We also have the allure of land in the West that's open for settlement. And so many uh, agricultural workers in the Eastern Europe want to go west to have their own farms, to own their own land for the first time in their lives. A last factor that is a pull is something that historians call chain migration. And chain migration is when a few immigrants arrive and they like what they see and they start sending money back and encouraging family members or friends or people within their community to migrate. And pretty soon, as if a chain is created, people begin to migrate in large numbers across the Atlantic or across the Pacific from Europe and from Asia to the Americas. And so this chain just continues to pull people over until entire communities, in some cases, have relocated over the course of 10 or 15 years to the United States. The experience of immigrating during the second half of the 19th century also becomes much easier. And this is another reason why so many more people leave Europe and Asia and come to the United States. New technologies such as the steamship make it much easier for immigrants to arrive in the United States because steamships are run on a regular schedule, as opposed to just when the wind is blowing, as had been during the age of sail. It also leads to faster shipping, makes it much easier. Prices come down as more competition happens between steamship lines. And so as a result, it's easier for immigrants to get to the United States. Well, once they reach the United States, many of them in the later decades of the 19th century go through Ellis Island, as we have pictured here. This is the reception center for immigrants in the United States. And for the most part, until the final decades of the 19th century, there isn't a very strict screening process. Physically, they're screened for communicable diseases. Their political leanings, left-wing radicals and anarchists are generally sent back to Europe if they admit to being radicals. And of course, morality, prostitutes and other people who are seen as criminals or seen as possibly engaging in criminal activities are not allowed into the United States. Once immigrants arrive in the United States, of course, the challenge is finding a place to live, finding a place to work. Many seek ethnic communities of people who are their fellow ethnicity in many of the cities that they arrive in, such as New York City, Baltimore, Boston. Others with a little bit of money buy railroad tickets, travel west to communities like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, where there are businesses that are, of course, hiring in large numbers. And so for immigrants, it's ultimately finding a place to settle or finding a way of traveling to a community where there are jobs available. This becomes really the driving factor in trying to settle in the United States. And once immigrants found employment, they would often settle in communities where fellow immigrants were living. And this became a way of maintaining ethnic identity, maintaining their own language, but also gradually adapting American culture and American habits as well. During the final decades of the 19th century, of course, there's a reaction against immigration. We call this nativism. And nativism was essentially this reaction by Americans, people born and raised in the United States, against immigrants, anti-immigration, basically a modern term for this. There had always been a certain anti-immigration sense in the United States, but during the end of the 19th century, this becomes quite large. This cartoon we have here shows Uncle Sam literally being eaten by European immigrants and by Chinese immigrants. These very stereotyped images that we have of Europeans and Asian immigrants. The idea was that there were too many immigrants in the United States. American values and American culture was being destroyed. And gradually the public begins to demand greater restrictions on immigration. So it's really in the final decades of the 19th century that we begin to see restrictions placed on immigration. And some of these restrictions, in the case of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, were essentially banning all Japanese and Chinese immigration, essentially closing the door to all people of Asian ancestry. In the case of Europeans, more restrictions on political identities, more restrictions on people with communicable diseases, and ultimately other types of ways that immigrants can be restricted during the end of this time period. Along with immigration, and certainly one of the factors that is encouraged by immigration is urbanization, or in other words, the growth of American cities during this era. American cities become extremely crowded, extremely densely populated during this time period. In 1800, at the beginning of the century, only about 5% of Americans actually live in cities. By basically 1900, by the first decade of the 19th century, nearly 50% of Americans are now living in cities. And this is a dramatic change. Part of this are Americans who migrate from rural areas like the farm to cities. And part of this is, of course, is immigration that we just talked about. Ultimately, American cities grow tremendously. Just to give you actual numbers, In just the decade of the 1880s and the 1890s, nearly 15 million Americans migrate. And if we look at that in a bigger picture, the decade of the 1870s through about 1920, we're talking about nearly 44 million people end up in American cities. So American cities just become crowded, noisy, polluted, and increasingly dangerous. These photos illustrate just how crowded places like Mulberry Street feature here, which is in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which was a heavily immigrant neighborhood. We look at some of these other images, we can see, for instance, here we have Philadelphia, one of these busy urban neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and increasingly going down to other places. Chicago, for instance, you can just see the press of traffic, street traffic, people trying to get by downtown Chicago. And even the back alleys and the back neighborhoods are also increasingly growing quick as people are just trying to settle wherever they can in many of these communities. Increasingly, as people struggled to find a place to live in these neighborhoods, many of them ended up in a place that we call tenements. And the tenement was essentially a type of apartment house, typically designed to house 7 or 8 families. The biggest problem was, of course, that rarely, if ever, were indeed 7 or 8 families living in these. They were essentially packed in as tightly as possible. And the end result of this was that many of these tenement houses had, in some cases, 20, 25 people packed into an individual apartment. And these were very narrow apartments, often no more than 25 feet wide at the part that faces the street. And again, 2 to 3 apartments per level, which resulted in just a densely packed. And there were hundreds and not thousands of these tenements all throughout, especially places like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia. Many of these, of course, typically had no indoor plumbing. There were wells and pit toilets in the back, oftentimes taking their water from the same place. Wood or coal stoves, no indoor heating of electrical nature or anything like that. And typically the ground floor oftentimes consisted of shops and the upper floors were residential. But even within these residences, typically people would have jobs at workshops at home where they would do sewing and other types of garment manufacturing. So typically you had very narrow, confined spaces with people simply packed in wherever they could fit. And some of these images are taken of New York tenements and just illustrate how densely packed so many of these tenement structures were throughout the entire city. Of course, just like cities in general, these tenements are dirty, they're dangerous, they're fire prone, and there's a constant problem in New York City and other urban communities trying to maintain law and order, trying to maintain sanitation, sewage, basic needs to keep these cities healthy. In many respects, by the beginning of the 1900s, America's cities are in trouble because they are indeed overcrowded. They are packed full of people. Many immigrants are living in these cities. In cities like Chicago, for instance, 3/4 of the city population by 1900 were immigrants. So just huge numbers of immigrants arriving in these cities. And as a result, filling these cities along with native-born Americans. One of the big reactions to this growth of an urban poor is that many middle-class and wealthy people flee in the cities. Cities go from being a location where it's mostly middle-class and wealthy people to being mostly poor. And the middle-class and wealthy people instead move out to the suburbs. So this is where we really see people beginning to leave and go to the suburbs where they can use transportation options like trolleys, trains to get to work as opposed to living within walking distance of their jobs. And so the cities ultimately become areas that are largely housed by poor people who have to live in the cities because they can't afford to live anywhere else and they have no other options, especially if they want to live close to their work. So as I just said, American cities become very overcrowded and prone to all sorts of problems by 1900 and a really, in a sense, very bad place to live for many of the people living in these cities. The final area I want to focus on that has to do with the Gilded Age is this transformation of the American West that happens during this same time period. It's important to keep in mind when we talk about the American West is that we're talking about the same economic, social, and technological forces that influence the development of the East. And in a sense, immigration, urbanization, and industrialization affect the West just as they affect the East during this time period. And in fact, by 1890, a higher percentage of Westerners actually lived in cities than people living in Eastern states. And in fact, the West was actually more ethnically diverse than the East. There were far more people of different ethnicities living in Western states than living in many cases, the West is actually a trendsetter when it comes to some of these big trends that we're talking about. Industries and technology certainly affected Western development. Of course, the railroad being one of these hugely important industries that has a role to play in Western development, allowed for easier migration to the West, permitted commercial agriculture on a large scale not seen in the East, and also made it easier just to transport raw materials, mining products from mines, as well as agricultural goods to the Midwest and the East to market. So important technology. Telephone and the telegraph. And we have an image here of building the railroad. And alongside, of course, is the hand telegraph. Telegraphs were a staple of the American West. And just the railroad, they allowed people to communicate easier with the East. For farmers, they allowed them to get current prices on crops like corn and wheat, and ultimately to know when to sell those products. So farmers in the West were very much wired in. They were very much connected to the East. Ultimately, the West is largely shaped by commercial agriculture, by extractive industries such as mining. And well, we tend to have this image of the West as being a place of the individual landowner, the homesteader, for example. The reality is that was a fairly minor part of the economic development of the West. It was largely large commercial farms. They called them bonanza farms, featured here. And these are farms that typically employed wage workers, that people who worked on these farms didn't own them. And they grew crops on a massive scale, on a commercial scale, as opposed to a small scale. And the same thing with the images here of mines. Mining is a very important staple of the West. And again, it's mostly wage workers. Very few people who work in mines own the mines. It's mostly hired labor. And so as a result, when the West develops, it's largely a market or a cash economy. It's not an economy where people are bartering and trading goods between each other. These are largely wage workers. They're earning money and they're using that money to buy things that are being imported into the West from the East. So it's important to keep in mind that, again, the West is a commercial economy. The West is not simply a place of the individual homesteaders making their own out in the wilderness. It's really a commercial society by the final decades of the 19th century. The federal government plays a tremendous role in Western development. And so the last thing I really want to focus on are some of the ways that the federal government influences Western development. The federal government plays an important role in encouraging people to go west through the Transcontinental Railroad Act of 1862, through the Olmstead Act of 1862. And these acts all encourage people to move west and settle in the West or start businesses in the West. The government also provided massive land grants to railroads. In fact, railroads received grants of land 20 miles on each side of the railroad tracks. And so essentially, once again, gave railroads a huge amount of land to contribute to settlers, to bribe settlers, basically, to go west with the offer of cheap or free land. Ultimately, of course, the biggest impact that the federal government plays in the West is by pacifying, subjugating, and displacing Native Americans. Because, of course, the West was not an unsettled place. Native Americans lived throughout the American West. And ultimately, the federal government takes it as its responsibility to pacify, subjugate, and ultimately remove or displace Native Americans from their homeland. And so, as we can see, Native Americans were certainly occupied major sections of the West. And for Plains Indians, especially, the buffalo was a major source of food and provided most of the basic necessities for their lives. One of the things that the federal government begins to do is actually hire people to decimate the herds of buffalo. Buffalo herds dropped from nearly 30 million at the beginning of this century to perhaps as few as 1,000 by late in the century. And American Indian tribes just couldn't live on this dwindling supply of buffalo and became increasingly dependent on the American government for food, for shelter, for basic necessities, which is exactly what the federal government wanted as a part of this project. So the U.S. Army is really the driving force behind this effort at pacifying and subjugating people living in the West, the Native American tribes in this area. But the federal government itself plays a very important role in redefining American policies towards Native Americans. Initially, the American government had treated Native Americans as independent nations, essentially, as separate. They called them domestic dependent nations, and used treaties, peace treaties, to settle disputes between the federal government and Native Americans. Beginning in the early 1870s, Congress changes how that works. In 1871, Congress actually just decides to get rid of the treaty system and treat Native Americans no differently than any other person living in the United States, to refuse to recognize tribal sovereignty, to refuse to recognize tribal rights, and just deal with Native Americans as if they were normal, everyday people living in the United States. And again, sends out the army to force Native Americans off of their tribal lands and on to reservations. Here we have this map that shows all of the tribal reservation lands that are created throughout the West, tiny little sections of land compared to these vast territories that Native Americans had been occupying prior to Western development. And of course, this doesn't happen without violence. Violence is a major part of this. Native Americans fight back. And of course, in a number of battles, such as the Little Bighorn in 1876, they do win. But these few and far between victories for Native Americans just serve to remind the whites in the East that the Native Americans are still a threat. And they still continue to press Congress, press the army to continue subjugating and ultimately pacifying the remaining Native American holdouts in this region until there are essentially no tribes left. They've been all forced on the reservation. Once tribes are on the reservation, Congress continues to look for ways to try to essentially end any kind of Native American identity. One of the most important of these congressmen is named Henry Lawrence Dawes. And Dawes is on a commission to try to figure out what to do with Native Americans once they've all been put on a reservation. 1887, Dawes pushes an act through Congress that's called the Severalty Act. And this is an act designed to essentially remove Native American identity by telling Native Americans if they left the reservations, they would be given free land and they'd also be given citizenship. But if they stay on the reservation, they will get nothing from the federal government. And as a result of this, the effort is made to try to force Native Americans off their reservations and make them into good American farmers as opposed to Native Americans. What ends up happening is that the Native Americans who refuse to leave the reservation, the land that's not occupied by Native American farms is actually sold out and given to white settlers. So many Native Americans actually lose most of their tribal land as a result of the Severalty Act. And this remains the situation until well into the 20th century. And it's only in actually the 1920s that the federal government recognizes Native American citizenship, gives Native Americans full civil rights, and allows them to actually begin the process of purchasing back tribal lands that were taken from them as a result of the Severalty Act. Clearly, the American government's Native American policy leads to a huge amount of suffering and a huge amount of injustice towards the people living in the West. But it ultimately is a policy that makes possible the extensive settlement of the West by white Americans and white Europeans, and ultimately leads to the extensive commercial development of the West that we've been talking about. So we have to, of course, consider that while the Gilded Age has certain positive things happening, it also has significant negative impacts as well, especially in the area of Native American policy and certainly in the area of urbanization. So it's important to understand that we have to balance both positives with the negatives when we look at this time period in American history.